Warframe teaches you how to build the perfect loadout before you start collecting dozens of different Warframes, before you spend hours trading with other players, mining rare ores, fishing in open worlds, or trying to figure out why you suddenly need a resource you've never even heard of before. There's one thing the game gets you doing almost immediately: moving. And I know that sounds obvious. Every game has movement. You walk around, maybe sprint a little faster, jump over a few obstacles, and that's usually enough. Warframe doesn't really settle for enough. Within your first few hours, you're bullet jumping across rooms, gliding through the air, bouncing off walls, sliding under obstacles, and generally moving around like someone who has absolutely no respect for gravity. And honestly, that's probably one of the smartest things the game does. Because even when you're confused by the menus, overwhelmed by progression systems, or wondering what half the items in your inventory are supposed to do, movement just makes sense. It feels good immediately. You don't need a guide to understand why launching yourself across an entire hallway is fun. And that's important because while a lot of players disagree about Warframe's story, its progression, its updates, or even its endgame, there's one thing almost everyone seems to agree on. Warframe is ridiculously fun to move around in, and over the years that movement has become much more than a way to get from one mission objective to another. It's become one of the defining parts of the entire game. One thing I've always found funny is that veterans and new players talk about Warframe almost like they're playing completely different games. Ask a veteran what Warframe is about and they'll start talking about builds, damage types, endgame content, farming routes, trading, incarnates, steel path, and all of that stuff. Ask a new player and they'll probably say something like, "Bro, I just flew across an entire hallway," because that's what stands out at first. I don't remember understanding much when I started playing. I remember accidentally bullet jumping and immediately trying to do it again, because the game somehow manages to make movement feel rewarding before you even understand why you're moving, and that's actually kind of important, because Warframe has a reputation for being confusing, and honestly, it's earned that reputation. But good movement buys the game time. You might not understand what you're doing, you might not understand where you're supposed to go next, you might not even know what half the rewards you're gonna actually do. But if traversing the map is fun, you're probably going to stick around a little longer. And sometimes that's all Warframe needs. A few extra hours, a little more patience, enough time for the rest of the systems to eventually start making sense, or enough time for the Stockholm Syndrome to kick in. Either way, it works, and I think that's why movement ends up being one of the strongest first impressions the game can make. Now here's something that happens after you played Warframe for long enough. You stop walking, not literally, of course. You can still walk. The game allows it, technically. But at some point, walking starts feeling like the least efficient solution to every problem. Why walk when you can sprint? Why sprint when you can slide? Why slide when you can bullet jump? And why bullet jump when you can chain it into an aim glide, roll on landing, and immediately launch yourself forward again? Warframe constantly rewards momentum. The faster you move, the smoother the game feels. And eventually, movement stops being a collection of separate actions. It becomes rhythm. You aren't consciously thinking, now I'll jump, now I'll glide, now I'll roll. Everything just starts blending together. Bullet jump, aim glide, roll, slide, repeat. And after enough hours, it becomes automatic. You stop looking at hallways and seeing corridors, you start seeing opportunities, every ledge becomes a launch point, every wall becomes part of a route, every room becomes a playground. Sometimes you'll even take a slightly longer route simply because it's more fun, not because it's faster, not because it's optimal, just because chaining movement together feels satisfying. And once that habit develops, something really funny starts happening. Other games begin to feel slow, not bad, just slow. You load into another shooter, you press jump, and instead of launching halfway across the room, your character performs a perfectly normal jump, like a reasonable human being, and somehow that feels disappointing. Warframe completely changes your expectations of what movement can feel like, and once that happens, it's surprisingly hard to go back. Now, up to this point, I have mostly been talking about movement as something that's fun, and don't get me wrong, it absolutely is. Half the reason people spend hundreds or even thousands of hours in this game is because simply moving around never really stops for good. But after a while, you start realizing that movement isn't just there to make the game feel cool. It's there because the game expects you to use it a lot. In many shooters, movement is mostly about getting from one fight to the next. Once the shooting starts, you find cover, hold an angle, and focus on aiming. Warframe doesn't really encourage that. In fact, if you stand completely still in Warframe, you're usually making a mistake. The game wants you moving constantly, jumping, sliding, rolling, changing positions, finding better angles, getting out of danger before danger even reaches you. And the longer you play, the more obvious that becomes. A new player sees movement as something flashy. A veteran sees movement as survival, because enemies can't hit what refuses to stay in one place. The game rewards momentum, it rewards aggression, and it rewards players who learn how to move efficiently. Eventually, you stop using movement because it looks cool. You start using movement because it keeps you alive. And honestly, some of the game's boss fights make that philosophy incredibly obvious. Take the Jackal, for example. For a lot of players, this is one of the first bosses they'll ever fight. At first glance, it seems pretty simple. Big robot, shoot weak points, avoid attacks, the usual stuff. But then it starts sending shockwaves across the arena, and suddenly standing still isn't an option anymore. You have to jump, you have to react, you have to pay attention to your movement, and looking back, it's actually kind of clever, because the fight isn't teaching damage, it's teaching mobility. It's basically telling the player, remember those movement mechanics you've been using, you're gonna need them now. And then, much later in the game, Warframe takes that same idea and cranks it up to 11, the Apollo list. Now, this fight is interesting because half the challenge isn't even shooting the boss, it's getting to the boss. You're moving between blackburns, using zip lines, traversing the arena, managing positioning, chasing objectives, etc. All while trying to not get thrown off the map, and constantly moving from one part of the encounter to another. At several points, simply knowing where to go is just as important as knowing what weapon you're holding. The fight almost feels like a final exam for everything the game has been teaching you about movement. Not because the movement itself is difficult, but because you're expected to use it naturally, without thinking, without stopping, without breaking the flow. And I think that's what makes this fight so memorable. They're not asking how much damage can you do, they're asking if you can move well enough to earn the opportunity to do damage. Because in Warframe, movement isn't something that happened before a combat. Sometimes movement is the combat. And that's probably one of the clearest examples of Warframe's design philosophy. The game doesn't separate movement and combat, it combines them. You aren't moving between fights, you're fighting while moving. Now here's the funny thing, Warframe's movement is so iconic nowadays that it's easy to forget it wasn't always like this. If you started playing recently, the movement system probably feels like something that has always existed. But older players remember a very different version of the game. Back then there was a stamina bar. Yeah, a stamina bar. I know, they don't like to talk about those dark times. Movement was slower, more restrictive, and the game hadn't fully figured out what it wanted to be yet. But players being players eventually found ways around those limitations. One of the most famous examples was something called capturing. And if you've never seen capturing before, it basically looked like the game was having a small physics-related panic attack, because players discovered that certain melee weapons could launch them forward at ridiculous speeds. And naturally, instead of ignoring it, everyone started doing it, because it was fun. And that's the important part. People were not using capturing because it was efficient. Maybe it was efficient, I'm gonna give you that, maybe it was efficient. But they were using it because it felt good. It made the game faster, it made the game more dynamic, it made the game more unique. And eventually, Digital Extremes noticed something. Players clearly wanted more movement, not less. So instead of removing mobility altogether, they leaned into it hard. And that's how we eventually got Parkour 2.0. And honestly, I think that's one of the smartest decisions they've ever made. Because Parkour 2.0 didn't just improve movement, it helped define Warframe's identity. Without it, I genuinely think Warframe would feel like an entirely different game today. A lot of games have shooting, a lot of games have loot, a lot of games have character customization. Very few games have movement that people actively miss when they stop playing. Warframe does, and that movement system is a huge reason why. Now, at this point, you might think, okay, I get it. Warframe has good movement, and honestly, that would already be enough. Most games would stop there. You have a good movement system, people like it, mission accomplished. But Warframe looked at that and they wanted to keep going because somehow bullet jumping through the entire rooms wasn't enough. Wall hopping wasn't enough. Aim gliding wasn't enough. Launching yourself across the map like a ballistic missile wasn't enough. No. Now we're moving to the vehicles, and holy shit do I love the vehicles, because this is where Warframe completely stops pretending to be normal. Before we even get into the actual vehicles, we need to talk about the operator and the drifter, because at some point Warframe basically looked at the movement system it had already built and said, what if we made a second one? Void Slaying completely changes how traversal feels. Instead of building momentum, you're basically teleporting through space. And I know some people still miss Void Dash. I'm not opening that can of worms, I'm not doing it. This video is long enough already, but regardless of which version you prefer, the point is that movement suddenly isn't tied to Warframe anymore. The game introduces an entirely different way to move around, and somehow it still feels like it belongs. Then we get Kaithes, winged horses. And honestly, the first time I got one of these, I spent way too much time doing absolutely nothing productive because they're just fun. You can fly, you can dive, you can explore the view from angles you were probably never intended to see. And unlike the rest of Warframe's movement systems, Kaithes aren't really about speed. They're about exploration, they're about looking around, they're about appreciating the environment, which is weird for Warframe because normally the game wants you moving at approximately the speed of a caffeine overdose. Kaithes are one of the few moments where the game actually encourages you to slow down a little, and I think that's why they work. Now let's talk about the Atomicycle, because if you've ever looked at Warframe and thought, you know what this game needs? A motorcycle. First of all, what is wrong with you? Second of all, congratulations, because Digital Extremes apparently agreed and somehow they made it work. The Atomicycle isn't the fastest way to travel, and it's not even close to other alternatives, because there are Warframes that can cross entire maps before you finish revving the engine, but that's not the point. The point is style, the point is looking cool, and honestly, Warframe has always been a game that understands the value of looking cool. Half of the decisions players make are based entirely on aesthetics. Don't lie to me, I know what game we're playing. Besides, it's a fucking war machine in a bike, why you wouldn't enjoy that? Now, if I had to pick the moment where Warframe completely shattered my understanding of scale, it would probably be the Archwing, because 1 second you're a space ninja, the next second you're basically a fighter pilot. The game suddenly goes from here's a hallway to here's an entire landscape, and that's a huge shift. Archwing doesn't just change movement, it changes how you perceive distance. Things that looked enormous before suddenly feel tiny. Entire areas become traversable in seconds, and honestly, flying through the plains of Eidolon for the first time felt like magic. I don't care how cheesy that sounds, it did. Deal with it. Now, K-drives are something interesting, because if Archwings represent efficiency, K-drives represent the complete opposite of this, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. Are they the fastest way to get around? Not even close. Are they the most practical option? not really. But if your goal is reaching point B as quickly as possible, there are plenty of better options. But I think that completely misses the point, because K-Drives aren't really trying to compete with Archwings. They're trying to be fun, and the first time I started doing tricks on one, I just remembered Tony Hawk games. And honestly, that's probably why I like them so much. There's something very Tony Hawk's Underground, Underground 2, and American Wasteland about them. You're grinding rails, chaining tricks together, looking for ridiculous jumps that definitely weren't meant to be taken at that angle, and occasionally launching yourself directly into a wall because you got a little too confident, which, if you ever played those games, is basically part of the experience. And that's what makes K-Drives special. They're not really about optimization, they're about expression. They're about seeing a giant pipe, ramp, cliff, or rail and thinking, I wonder if I can do something stupid with that. And honestly, sometimes that's more memorable than reaching your destination 5 seconds faster. And lastly, we have Merulina, which is probably the most biased section of this video because I am in early. So if this suddenly starts sounding like propaganda, that's why. Merulina, it's basically Digital Extremes looking at the K-Drive and asking, what if we did combat on this thing? Which sounds ridiculous, because it is ridiculous, and somehow it works. Most games separate movement and combat. Warframe keeps finding ways to smash them together. So now you have a hoverboard that doubles as a survival tool, that doubles as a movement system, that doubles as a combat platform, and also doubles as a pet. And somehow nobody at Digital Extremes looked at this idea and said, maybe we're doing too much, because doing too much is basically Warframe's entire identity. One thing I really like about Warframe's movement system is that after enough time, it stops feeling like a mechanic and starts feeling like part of the player's identity. And I know that sounds a little weird, but hear me out. If you watch two people play Warframe, there's a good chance they'll move completely differently from each other. Not because the game forces them to, but because they've naturally developed their own habits. A Ghost player doesn't move like a Juroli player. A Titania player doesn't move like a Grendel player. Someone farming relics isn't moving the same way as somebody exploring Dubiri. And that's one of the coolest things about the game. Eventually, movement becomes a form of expression. You can usually tell what kind of player somebody is just by watching them for a few minutes. Some players move with absolute efficiency. Every jump has a purpose, every route is optimized, every corner is cut as tightly as possible, and then you have people like me, where the route might technically be slower, but if there's a cool jump available, I'm doing the cool jump. Efficiency can wait. The point is that Warframe gives players room to develop their own style, and not every game does that. A lot of games have movement systems, but Warframe has movement personalities, and after enough time you stop thinking about how you're moving and you just move, which is honestly one of the biggest compliments I can give any movement system. Because when something becomes a second nature, it means the controls have gotten out of your way. You're no longer thinking about buttons, you're thinking about what you want to do, and the game simply keeps up. Now, I know this sounds like the most stereotypical Warframe player statement ever made, but I genuinely think Warframe ruins other games. Not because other games are bad, not because every game should have bullet jumps, but because after enough time playing Warframe, your brain starts expecting movement to work a certain way. You get used to speed, you get used to momentum, you get used to having options, and then you go play literally anything else. You press jump, your character performs the most normal jump you've ever seen, and suddenly you're disappointed. Not because the game did anything wrong, but because Warframe has completely broken your perception of what normal movement looks like. And honestly, I don't think I realized this until I started playing other games after spending a lot of time with Warframe. You'll see a ledge and think, I can make that jump, and then immediately remember that you're not playing Warframe anymore. You're playing a game where gravity actually exists. You start looking for walls to jump off, you start trying to slide, you start expecting momentum to carry you farther than it actually will, and every now and then your brain has a brief moment where it forgets what game you're currently playing. And trust me, this has happened to me a lot of times while playing other games. What's funny is that this doesn't happen because Warframe's movement is necessarily faster than everything else, it's because of how much freedom it gives you. Movement rarely feels restrictive because if you want to cross a room, there are 10 different ways to do it. If you want to reach a platform, there's probably an intended route, and there's probably also a route that makes absolutely no sense but somehow works anyway. Warframe constantly rewards experimentation, and once you've spent hundreds of hours with that level of freedom, it's hard to not miss it elsewhere. Now, obviously, there are other games with great movement. Titanfall exists, Mirror's Edge exists, Doom has fantastic momentum, Ultra Kill is one of the greatest examples I can think of movement right now. There are plenty of games that understand how satisfying movement can be, but Warframe still feels unique. Partially because of how fast it is, partially because of how much control it gives to the player, and partially because movement isn't confined to one system. Throughout this entire video, we've talked about building jumps, aim glides, wall hopping, void slinking, Archwings, Kaithes, K-drives, Merlina, motorcycles, and probably several things that would sound completely insane if I described them to someone who has never played the game. Most games have one movement system. Warframe has an entire collection of them, and I think that's why it sticks with people. Years later, you might forget a specific mission, you might forget a specific weapon, you might forget a specific update, but you'll probably remember how the game felt, and that's a pretty impressive thing for a movement system to accomplish.